So, welcome to our October webinar on online abuse in sport. My name is Gary. This webinar series is presented jointly by the FIA, DCU, and the United Against Online Abuse Coalition. So, we're delighted today to have two speakers. Well, one so far. Yako is it's dealing with the dreaded Zoom update, so he'll join us soon, hopefully. But we have Pelissa Mashko here, and both herself and Jaco van Sterkenburg are from Erasmus University Rotterdam. And they're going to present their work on institutionalized forms of racism in football industry. So just a note on our two speakers. So Pelissa's PhD explores race, racism, and inclusion in professional European football. The project is a collaboration between Erasmus University, Fair Network, FIFA Pro, and UEFA. Her research interests are focused on critical race studies as it pertains to media representation, media policy, and structural inequality. So, Pelissa received her Bachelor in Journalism from Rhodes University in South Africa, and where she specialised in television broadcasting. For Jaco, his research focuses on everyday forms of race and anti-racism interventions across the football industry as well, including football management and leadership. Football players, football media, and football video gaming as well. He leads a research group at Erasmus University that explores privileging or marginalizing of different racial ethnic groups with a focus on sports and media. So he's also received several prizes and grants for innovative and impactful research work on race discrimination and sports media. So as usual with the hour or so we have, our speakers will speak maybe for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll leave it open to questions. So, Pelissa, I'll hand it over to your capable hands. Thank you so much for coming to speak to our webinar series.
Oh, no, thank you so much. Thank you, Gary, and thank you all so much for your patience. Again, I apologize for the technical difficulties that my supervisor and I have been having. But yeah, very happy to be with you and tell you a little bit more about our project. Thank you there, Gary, for also, essentially providing an introduction to our project that Jaco was hoping to contextualize a little bit more. But yes, as you stated, we are working on this 4-year project where we're studying race and racism really broadly within European football. And we do have different themes that we are focusing on. Right now in my presentation, I will be zooming into one of those focuses, which is the focus on football leaders and sort of, race and racism within European football, which really sort of ultimately speaks to racism in European football culture. I think as long as everyone can hear me okay, because I can't see anything but my screen, we can, move forward. What you can expect from this presentation is a real sort of brief background on the research paper, and I will sort of somewhat delve into the theoretical framework and research design, but I'll try keep that as succinct as possible and really get to the juicy bits, which is, ultimately the findings. Again, to say that this was the first study for the sort of larger project on race and racism. And the paper is titled "A Rotten Apple or a Rotten Tree: Football Leaders' Perceptions of Race and Racism in European Football." Yes, and so I think it's really important to note now that obviously this project and this particular paper was done by me and my supervisor, Dr. Cole van Stakenberg, and my other two supervisors, which is Dr. Joao Gonçalves and Dr. Teresa de la Hara. So shout outs to them for their contributions to this first study. For many of you, this might be a familiar face. And for those of you who might not be as aware of him, this is Vinicius Jr., Brazilian-born forward, who's currently represents Real Madrid. Many of you may recall that in the spring of 2023, he was subjected to racial abuse by fans in the stands. And this, unfortunately, is a rather quite common occurrence for Vinicius. Him, like many players of color, are often the subjects of racial abuse. With on the pitch within European football, but on this particular occasion, uh, yeah, Vinicius went on to his social media channels and really expressed the state of racism within Spanish football, very specifically. And some of what he said was this wasn't the first time, or the second time, or the third time. Racism is normal in La Liga. The competition thinks it is normal. The federation does too, and opponents encourage it. As you can imagine, the incident in itself and Vinicius's statement went on to sort of send some shockwaves throughout the football world and received a response. This is Javier Tebas. He is the president of La Liga. And in his response to Vinicius, he stated that it was unfair for Vinicius to suggest that Spain or La Liga was racist, as he believed it is not. And then, as you can see here, he says that cases of racism are an extremely rare occurrence. At the time of this, when we were working on this paper, this was the sentiment that Javier sent. And he has slightly changed his tone ever so slightly. So recently, he hailed Vinicius as a leader within the football space for encouraging more awareness on the topic. However, you will notice that in the way that he continues to frame racism within Spanish football, is his focus is on the quote unquote rotten apples, sort of these isolated instances, as opposed to really reflecting and being more reflexive about the systematic or systemic nature of racism within La Liga. And more recently, we see that with how football leaders within European football, the way that they speak about racism within this space, indicates a lack of acknowledgement of the structural nature. And here, this is a recent example. I think this has happened in the last 2 or 3 weeks that you may have heard about. I think this is 21-year-old Kristanos Uche, who's a Nigerian footballer who recently started playing with, and apologies for my pronunciation, Katafe, the Katafe club. And so he recently spoke to a journalist about his experiences with racial abuse by fans, but focused also a lot on the unfair treatment he believed he was getting from referees. And so the response that this him speaking out got from the president of the club was that he essentially criticized Uche for sharing this, and also suggested that Uche hadn't been in Spain long enough and didn't understand the Spanish language as well as he could, so he may have misunderstood what the referee or the was saying, or and so again, somewhat of a dismissal of Uche's experiences, just an example, or that gives us insight in the framing or the perceptions of race and racism within the European football world. This gets us to thinking about what some of the literature says about common ways that race and racism is spoken about by football leaders. And we see here that it's common for leaders to dismiss racist incidents as individual acts. So really separating the collective, the football community from, again, the quote unquote rotten apples. And this internalization of the belief that, the football environment is a race neutral space that does not discriminate. And that football is really based on merit. So as long as you are a good footballer, you will make it up the ranks. And so yeah, so these are the some of the common ways that we see that football leaders speak. But then, yeah, what is this problem that we're trying to make sense of? Racism persists in football on and off the pitch, and despite some of the efforts that stakeholders are making. And I think Tebes would suggest that since the incident with Vinicius, there have been some significant changes. However, we still, as Uche's the example of Uche that happened 3 weeks ago illustrates, that the problem persists, right? And perhaps we can connect this in part to the lack of representation of people of color in important positions. And I think Jaco would have also spoken about this in a little bit more detail. The governance index report that he was involved in. As well as Fair Network, really shows that this discrepancy shows that the football world is predominantly controlled by white men, with white women having small, parts in it, and almost women of color are almost absent from these positions of power, as well as non-white men. And just again to maybe show a glimpse into what does this actually look like. Maybe if we look at, again, the Spanish football context, this is the executive board of La Liga currently as it is. And again, just shows you or gives you an idea of some of those numbers and what this might look like in real life. And this gets us to this question, or rather, yeah, what are we trying to understand here? Not just in this particular study, but I think in our overall project, is really trying to grapple or make sense of the systems and behaviors that enable or sustain exclusionary practices based on race and other intersecting identities like gender and sexuality. And yeah, so our research question, and again, I'm so sorry about time. Hopefully, we can, yeah, make it through this. Yeah, the research question is: what are the experiences and perceptions of football leaders in addressing race-related discrimination, and how do these experiences and perceptions facilitate or limit anti-racism practices in European football? A bit of a mouthful, but again, a real quick glimpse. I'm going to try get through the theoretical framework and research design somewhat quickly. But critical race theory, in the sense, provided an understanding of how we can think about racial ideology in the European context. And ultimately, principles include acknowledging racism as this endemic part of society, principle of challenging the sort of color blindness and race neutrality that we see in the way that football leaders speak, as we've seen in the two examples that I've shown. It also, the critical race theory also advocates for centralizing marginalized voices and their experiences, and is also a theoretical framework that really aims not only to understand, but to contribute to social change. And so, yeah, to give you an idea of the lens that we used in this research paper, and again, a quick glimpse of how cultural studies was employed, just helping us understand how we can connect culture, language, and ideology, and ultimately understanding that the way that people speak and maybe more specifically, the way that football leaders speak in the sports world is not isolated. It's not fixed, and it exists within a particular historical context. And so we, yeah, moved forward into the research design. So conducted semi-structured interviews with football leaders from these various European countries. Yeah, using the frameworks that I just spoke about, and yeah, also employing critical discourse analysis and thematic analysis to help us make sense of what the football leaders had to say. And this brings us to, yeah, who were the people or leaders that we were fortunate to interview? They are definitely not an easy group to access. And so, yeah, really thankful for the leaders who availed themselves. And so, yeah, yeah, leaders from 8 countries. Of those 12 leaders that were interviewed, 3 were women and 9 were men, which again sort of gives some sort of tangibility to the numbers that or the statistics that I showed earlier about football leadership. And these leaders, the age range, yeah, from 30 to 48 years old. So I think a nice little broad idea there. These 12 football leaders, you could say, held positions in middle management. They were either like heads or managers or directors of units within football organizations or associations, or yeah, associated organizations, and also included legal experts in the fields of yeah, particularly work around equality and what is considered diversity and inclusion and equality work, as well as sort of, yeah, football social responsibility work to some degree. Yeah, the leaders that we spoke to had experience in these particular fields. And so now we can get to the findings. I really don't know how I'm doing for time. But yeah, so out of these conversations that we had with these football leaders, 3 themes emerged. And one of those themes was diversity and corporatized football practices. So, what we noticed is that a lot of the discourse around talking about diversity and inclusion was really yeah, laced with corporate jargon, which was really interesting. And just to show you an example, this particular participant yeah, mentions this idea of football, yeah, being very male dominated, and that it's not really modern within the football environment, and doesn't really accept anything that doesn't involve men playing football. And so, from their perspective, anything outside of sort of this white male domain is considered diversity. And just sort of the language of using it. Yeah, so women's football is a project, and that it is something to be sold. So speaking about these diversity and inclusion portfolios as projects that have targets, and yeah, just yeah, really commercializing that. And something else we noticed is that the perceptions of work practices were generally considered to be inclusive on paper. And so a lot of the leaders we spoke to just believed that by default, the work environments that they worked in were really, yeah, inclusive spaces, because on paper they did tick the DI or boxes. And then another interesting observation was how, in talking about diversity and inclusion, another default position was talking about it in gendered terms. And so, when you would ask a leader about their thoughts on diversity, they would firstly talk about women and the representation of women within football position leadership positions, and how that was getting better within their work environments. Interestingly enough, there didn't seem to be an intersectional lens included in that. And so most of the time, these leaders were talking about the representation of white women in football leadership positions. Yeah, and then we can move on to the second theme that emerge, which speaks about the discriminatory actions that were isolated from wider football culture and community, and ultimately this sort of showed how. Uh, Football leaders spoke about the football community as the sacred space, and that anything that happened outside of that was external, like all the sort of discrimination we can associate with external factors. But yeah, to start off, what we see in this theme is when talking about racism in football, these actions or this behavior was generally seen or spoken about in explicit forms. And so when you ask about, what do you understand as racial discrimination? Many of the leaders would identify monkey chants, for example. And then there was a tendency by leaders to think of a diverse pitch as a reflection of an inclusive football culture. And we see an example of that in this quote from another participant who said, when they would go to clubs to talk about this issue, they would say, uh, this participant said that, yeah, they don't see the problem. The main thing that the participant would hear is that it's not happening here. It was not an issue at the moment, and that, yeah, they'd say, look at my field. We're very diverse here, and so that was a common sentiment. And again, speaking to what I said earlier about the football community as being sacred, space that isn't tainted by, racial discrimination. Leaders associated racist behavior, particularly fans, as often sort of, yeah, the perpetrators and aggressors, and that, yeah, racism didn't really exist or doesn't necessarily occur within their sacred football community. And just the last finding, and apologies if I've gone over time, leadership and resistance to change. And what we see here, all the football leaders interviewed were able to identify that their spaces and those who were in senior positions was predominantly older white men. And so, yeah, there was just a lack of diverse representation there. This particular participant says, yeah, European football is ruled by white male older men, and that from the participants' perspective, the reason that nothing is being done is because issues around race and racism are just really not high up on their agenda. And so, yeah, this seeps into sort of outdated traditions and practices, which are reproduced and then, yeah, racial discrimination is considered from the perspective of some leaders is that racial discrimination is considered a priority, but not necessarily urgent. And this may sort of suggest that, these issues become urgent when there becomes a PR issue or problem that needs to be resolved. Um, but now, in some of the conclusions that we made or arrived at from the raw data is that, yeah, corporatized practices tend to provide short-term solutions to addressing racism. And currently, we can argue that the approach to diversity policy making really lacks an intersectional lens. There's an absence of recognizing how various forms of oppression affect different people, particularly people of color and women of color in various ways. And that, yeah, practitioners are less likely to adopt a social justice framework when talking about sort of making connections between race and racism issues to social justice. Was there was an aversion to that because there's somewhat of a political connotation to this idea of social justice. And the systemic nature of racism is most definitely not sufficiently acknowledged within football leadership, which leads to implicit forms of racism like microaggression. Microaggressions being overlooked within this football space. And finally, uh, speaking on the lack of representation that we see in football leadership, there's a resistance to change. The idea is that this change is radical and has implications on power and them having power. And so the cycle continues of perpetuation of discriminatory actions and harmful traditions that are normalized. And this speaks to the idea of sports and football being this meritocracy, and sports not being political. And so we which makes it really difficult to effectively look at issues around race and racism. And that's me, or that's us, I should rather say. I hope Yako is here now, but apologies if I've gone over time. I look forward to some of your questions and responses. Thank you.
Decent. No, you're so concerned about time. We have plenty of time. And I'm presuming we have quite a lot of questions as well. So usually how we do the questions is if you want to raise the kind of virtual Zoom hand or you want to put it in the chat, we can go about through that way. So I'll leave it open to the floor. Well, I have one anyway. Police. One of the things that came to mind when you start talking about the leadership was about fan ownership. And I was wondering if in any of your interviews you came across or you're involved with clubs or interviewed clubs that had that were fan owned in their structure. And if not, do you think that would have any influence on the type of corporate policies and approach to diversity that a club would have?
Oh, sorry, Gary, can you please repeat that? What do you mean by, that relationship with the fans at the
No,
clubs?
in terms of ownership, that the actual club is owned by fans or has a
Um,
large proportion of their shares owned by fans. Did any of the clubs you interviewed have that?
no, no. So the leaders that I spoke to, that never came up. And so, I have very little knowledge of how much ownership fans may have had in those particular organizations. So, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so just wondering, particularly in Germany, like just anecdotally, the clubs there seem to have a bigger voice against around not against sorry in support of social justice issues. So I'm wondering if the ownership is fan based like a lot of the German clubs, whether that has an influence on actual policy then in terms of the management and policies around diversity.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I don't have a lot of knowledge about that in terms of the ownership, but I would imagine that there might be, because these fans have stakes in how these organizations present themselves. But I would still argue that, in terms of the hierarchy of where the fans are, and the kind of influence that they could have, I think that might be slightly limited. I think ultimately and I guess from what we get from the football leaders, although a lot is being attempted to address the issues, ultimately I remember one particular leader saying, if this is not, even though we want things to be different, if this is not embraced by those at the top, it's just it's just not going to happen, or it's going to be limited in the way that it ultimately happens. So yeah, but I do think fan ownership has like a has some effect, but I would say that I would assume that it's still limited in the kind of impact it can have.
Yeah. Okay. Yako, you have your hand up there.
Yes, I'm here. Yeah, I'm sorry for coming so late. It was a disaster here with the technical issues. Can you hear me okay now? This
Yeah, all good.
because I do it now from my phone, which because I ask colleagues, they have the same problem. Somehow the security in our university doesn't let me in, and I think Palesa, you may work on your personal laptop perhaps, but somehow there's a problem with the security with entering. Anyway, I'm here now. I don't have a question. I just wanted to say apologies for being late. I can still do a presentation, although I send it to you by email, so you need to upload it, I think. But yeah, just see, I listened in already in Palesa's presentation, and yeah, I mean, Palesa has done a lot of great work on the work on leadership and race, and is currently actually doing work with football players and their experiences with racism across Europe and even worldwide. So yeah, to my knowledge, not so much has been done on how players experience racism. And especially doing in-depth interviews with players is difficult. So that's another study that will come up with Palesa and myself, which is interesting.
Okay, great to hear. Idris, you had a question there. You had your hand up.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for your presentation. I was kind of wondering, I saw kind of in the beginning that first chart about representation, and I know in the US there were studies about athletes of color breaking into leadership positions and how that was a super big problem over there. So I was wondering if you had seen in Europe and European football and maybe your work with athletes now, if that was a problem that had been discussed with the executives, and if you kind of saw that similar issue of transitioning from playing into a leadership position. Thank you.
Thank you, Idris. Yes, most definitely. There are a lot of parallels between sports in the US and in Europe. And what we've seen in football, that definitely that transition from players to football leadership uh, is most definitely there's a disparity for non-white players. And some of the work that I think Jaco has done, and something that's actually come up within my own research now on the players, is that we find that the perceptions of football players, and so there are these racialized stereotypes that players of color are really sort of perceived within sort of this physical lens. And so they're considered the sort of laborious workers who are very strong and are very fast. And so this is sort of the lens and the frame and it's a very common way of speaking about players of color. And so how does this affect their transition? Because they're seen through this prism, and they are, when talking about these players, they're also not given positions that are considered to be more technical or require decision-making capabilities. And there's a lot of research, again, that Jaco's done, and that I also read recently about racial stacking. And so there are also numbers to this. And so again, like I say, that prism, the industry has this widely shared prism that affects football players then taking up positions of leadership because there's a perception, that sort of their intellectual abilities are limited in comparison to their white counterparts. And so, maybe Jaco would like to add a little bit more there because he's done a lot of work on that. But most definitely, Idris, we're seeing that in a European football, most definitely. But I can't really speak to how sort of progressive Europe is in comparison to the US but ultimately not progressive enough, I would say.
So, Roshni, you had a question.
Thank you, Gary. Hi, Palesa. Always nice hearing a South African on screen. On your conclusion, there were three things that were super interesting. You mentioned that the systemic nature of racism is not sufficiently acknowledged. Secondly, that there's a perpetuation of discriminatory actions. And the third one that struck me was the practitioners are less likely to adopt the social justice system. For me, those three seem to almost speak together. There may be a thread there. Could you speak to us a bit more about the social justice framework?
Hi, Roshni. Always really lovely to hear a South African voice. And yeah, thank you for your question, which I think is not an easy question to answer. And I think by saying or using the word social justice framework, because a lot of this research was focused on the way language. And so, what we really see commonly in the language, like I said, sort of this commercialized way of speaking, but we're talking about race and racism. And racism is inherently connected to political issues. And so, they're more inclined towards that. And what that requires is, and a suggestion we're sort of making is that that requires sort of a reflexivity that football leaders will ultimately say, yes, our institutions are racist. Our institutions are a legacy of racism, historically speaking. And so I think it starts from that standpoint, and asking leaders to look inwardly within their organizations and saying, okay, so how do we see this legacy of racism manifest within our institutions, and sort of work from there. And we are seeing a resistance in doing that. And again, I think the paper tries to grapple with it, but it's really tricky because sports works in this meritocracy sort of framework. Like, we are all only merit based. Anyone can make it here as long as they're a good player. But at the same time, you're trying to deal with an issue like race and racism that is political, and that there's also a commercial aspect to sports and football. And so there are sort of three interests here that are somewhat in conflict with each other, that makes it really difficult to effectively address these issues. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, this is some of what we see. And ultimately, yeah, it would be great to hear more football leaders saying, actually, yes, like the example I gave with Javier Tebas, him saying that no, Spain is not racist, and the La Liga is not racist. It would have been an important opportunity to maybe say, no, you know what, we are affected by the legacy of racism, and there's a historical context to Spain, and there's a historical context to social institutions like La Liga. And so how do we have to acknowledge that and grapple with those issues. And so, yeah, sorry, I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, just thinking it's really difficult for the architects of the issue to see the issue. And hence that systemic justice system is possibly the only enabler to address this. But who becomes the architect of that if the others are excluded or not included? Let me rather put it that way. Thanks, Palisa.
Neil, you have your hand up. We lost you, Neil.
No, I'm here. Can
Yeah.
you hear me, Gary?
Yeah, can hear you. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, the reception here is a little bit bogey in this office, so apologies. Thanks, Palesa. That was really, really interesting. Lots of parallels, I think, in sports research at the moment in terms of systemic discrimination. I'm thinking of discrimination towards the LGBTQ community, for example. Someone like Cunningham's sort of multi-level research looking at the micro, meso, macro, that sort of stuff. But can I just ask you one very basic question? And maybe I missed it at the beginning, but it's in terms of your interviewees. They're football leaders, I think is how you describe them. But who exactly are these people? What I'm wondering about, Palesa, is are there diversity officers in these sorts of clubs? Because I would presume that if they're very big clubs, there would be diversity officers and there would be a sort of an internal reorganization to address some of these things. So was it possible to interview some people in those positions, for example?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Neil. And most definitely. And so, not all of these football leaders were diversity officers per se. However, all the football leaders in some capacity had experiences with equality work. And again, quote unquote, sort of, yeah, diversity portfolio. So they had experiences with that, but they were at different levels or held different positions within the sports organizations they were in, whether it was associations or unions. But ultimately they had some kind of contact with the diversity portfolio, if you will. Does that answer that?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. That's fine. I just wasn't sure, were they a corporate sort of senior corporate people, or were these people whose positions were officially in diversity, were as in diversity officers or so on?
Yeah. And so I think, yeah, the term we used to sort of put them all, because we also had like legal experts there who also had contact with equality work, but ultimately we described them under the category of middle management. And so they were not necessarily the ones who vetoed decisions within the organizations, but they had seats to the table. They had seats at the table where some decisions were being made in terms of diversity work. And again, sometimes if we were speaking to leaders of unions, depending on the size of the union or the organization, they would have different resources. And so one particular individual would actually have to wear so many different hats and caps that would then include diversity work in addition to a whole lot of other responsibilities. And so that's also something that you saw.
Yeah, thanks, Felicia. That, like, I think that in of itself sometimes tells us a lot as well, doesn't it? That there's one person perhaps, and I'm thinking in the context of Ireland sports organizations, sometimes there's literally might be one person whose entire remit is diversity, and then there's a sense that the box is ticked because we have this person there, and it's not of a sort of a full football culture or sports culture approach. It's sort of where we just segregate it and we place it in one area, and then that they'll let them devise a diversity policy, and therefore everything, that box is kind of ticked, as it were. But okay, thanks very much. Thank you.
Jaco? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to follow up. I'm just following the discussion with great interest. Indeed, the thing with the leaders that were being interviewed, I think and Palais, I think you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation or in your results, I missed that. But what still surprises me to some extent is the relatively limited definition or conceptualization that many football leaders, also those working in this diversity area, and sometimes indeed it's one person with different hats, but even they have quite a limited definition, still often saying things like, yes, we are very diverse on the pitch, and that is why we cannot be racist or anything, right? So they look at the pitch, they see the diversity of players, and even and I must say, I have the impression, at least for instance from the Netherlands, that this limited definition is even more prominent within football clubs compared to the national association. But it always surprises me that they tend to ignore the more institutionalized or more implicit forms of racism, even the diversity officers sometimes within these spaces. So when I do a presentation on implicit stereotypes or racial stereotypes that may play a role and may form the breeding ground for explicit racism to occur, they already start looking at me like, implicit, what are you talking about? I mean, that's kind of, there's a resistance to discuss that kind of racism. And I find it problematic, but it shows also that it's quite difficult to do really anti-racism work, or to, as researchers, to reach the leaders with our messages?
I'm wondering, is there a, you're specifically talking about clubs, it being a problem in, is there a club that is an example of best practice at how to manage issues like that you've come across? Like who's doing this well, or
Yeah.
who's doing this better than the rest anyway?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, Palesa, I don't know. Have you managed to find any leaders in your interviewees who were? I think there was not a specific club being mentioned, right? In that regard.
No, no. We try to make sure that, yeah, no specific clubs were mentioned, or that organizations or associations weren't really identifiable.
Yeah.
But yeah, and yeah, I really think that everyone is trying the best that they can with what they have. But yeah, I'm sure I can't really think of now specific, but oh, maybe let
Well,
me say one particular leader that I spoke to was talking about how they were approaching vacancies within their organization, and how they were rethinking those structures, particularly when it came to CVs. And so they removed this sort of element of names, I think it was, within their CVs, or yeah, but they were really restructuring that process yeah, because they did find that that sometimes, someone's name that might sound, again, quote unquote, foreign or different, might have a much more difficult time of making it through an organization or not. And so, yeah, they were just trying to rethink those processes. And I think that's just one really small example of, yeah, trying, and also recognizing that sometimes if you put in a position up online, that for for a position within your organizations, that there are a lot of people who are not within that network that have access to that information, and they're thinking of ways on how do we get to groups that are often marginalized and then don't have access to these networks. How do we get to them? And so, yeah, they were thinking about those steps. But I also think it's important to note that this particular individual was one of only two people of color who were in these positions. And yeah, and so perhaps you can make some connections to some of the change they were trying to implement there. But yeah, I think everyone's trying to do the best that they can with what they have. But yeah, there's still a
well,
lot
but
to be done.
Gary, I think also it's a good question. But on the other hand, yeah, if, for example, in the Netherlands there are a few good examples, let's say, like Feyenoord Rotterdam, who did a lot of work on anti-Semitism, for example, in the stadium. However, even though it may it seemed for a long time a good example, but what you notice is that when things get like, let's say, after the pandemic, when clubs had difficulties financially, then the first thing that gets off the list, right, from priorities, is these kind of initiatives. So that means, in the case of Feyenoord, that after the pandemic, the whole anti-Semitism program that they had and that they were praised for, that whole program did not really start up anymore. So even though you have a good example, it sometimes also is only temporarily. Right. I think in England there are some good examples. I hear good stories about Brentford, for example, but I have not enough knowledge on that particular club. But I know that it's sometimes just also temporarily, these good examples.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah, I think the various different types of ownership structures, well, as I said earlier, whether it's fans or whether it's kind of more traditional commercial, or whether it's even kind of state owned, is an interesting kind of comparison to make across how they deal with these issues. But anyway, yeah. So I think we have time for one more question. If anyone else has anything they want to add, or even a final point from yourselves, Palesa and Jaco.
I can make a final point, but
Yeah.
maybe Palesa, you also. I mean, just to kind of mention that while we're talking about football leadership in this particular seminar, so the studies that I've done in, let's say, football journalism, I was going to present a bit about that as well. Football journalism, we see a lot of similarities there with the football leader. So I mean, it seems the more I do, and the same, let's say, with the I'm recently going more into the football gaming, like the football gaming domain, like the football games, like FIFA games and everything. I mean, the more I go into these different football domains, let's say, you see the same processes everywhere. So it seems like the football industry as a whole, that kind of includes many different kind of subdomains, that what we have discussed today about football leadership applies to all these other subdomains as well, which is of course problematic, and which says something about maybe the football world. You know, of course, football leadership is important, very important, but then it applies apparently also to these other domains, which is a reason for concern. And I think there are quite a lot of topics that especially related to implicit forms of racism, institutionalized forms of racism, that just meet a lot of resistance in all these subdomains within football.
No, absolutely. Well, yeah, I think it's probably a good moment to end, and I want to thank to both of you for taking the time to share your research, and good luck with the PhD, Pelisa. It's absolutely fascinating and really important work that you're doing. Um, yeah, so just for anyone who came late or anyone who wants to return to the material or other webinars we have, the recording for this should be up by the end of the week on the UAOA website. I'll send around the link. And just to note too, we have Connor Penfold, who will be presenting his work on disablism for our November webinar too. So I'll send around details on that as well. And other than that, I just want to thank you again for all coming, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon, whatever you may be doing. And I hope to see you again soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.